What if I told you that the only thing standing between you and everything you want to achieve is not your circumstances, not your resources, not even your abilities, but simply the way you think? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change how you approach every goal, every dream, and every challenge from this moment forward. Everything is in your mind. The way you think determines how far you get, not as a motivational phrase, but as a practical reality. The goals you set for yourself, the dreams you pursue, and the results you build depend largely on how your mind functions when you decide, when you doubt, and when you face difficulty. Many people want to achieve more in their life. They have clear objectives and genuine desires to advance. However, over time those objectives are postponed or abandoned, not because they're impossible, but because the way of thinking with which they try to sustain them doesn't accompany the process. The intention exists, but the mind is not prepared to sustain it. Achieving everything doesn't mean obtaining everything without effort or at the same time. It means reaching that which you propose consciously and sustaining it over time. A disordered mind wants results, but doesn't sustain processes. A mind without clarity gets enthusiastic, but abandons. And a mind that reacts to everything ends up distancing itself from its own goals. This audiobook starts from a central idea. Everything you aspire to achieve begins in your way of thinking, not in what you desire occasionally, but in how you interpret problems, how you speak to yourself internally, and how you decide when nobody observes you. That way of thinking influences every day, even when you're not conscious of it. When there's no mental order, goals become heavy, postponement appears, constant doubt, and the feeling that advancing costs too much. Not because it's not possible, but because the mind is not structured to accompany effort with clarity and constancy. Thinking well is not thinking positively all the time. It's thinking with direction. It's thinking in a way that backs your decisions and doesn't weaken them, that is trained not all at once, but with attention and practice. When the mind begins to order itself, action becomes clearer and advance stops feeling chaotic. Here you'll learn to observe how you're thinking, to order your ideas, and to strengthen a mentality that allows you to advance toward what you propose without abandoning before difficulty, not to promise immediate results, but to show you that what you propose is possible when your mind stops being an obstacle and becomes a tool. Before continuing, do something simple. If this message connects with you, write in the comments a goal that today is important to you. Naming it is a way of giving it clarity. And if this type of content helps you think better, accompany this audiobook to continue building a mentality oriented to real progress. This is the starting point. Everything is in your mind, and learning to think better is the first step to convert your goals and dreams into real results. Chapter 1. Your way of thinking is defining what you achieve. Many people believe their results depend mainly on external factors. The environment, opportunities, available time, or even luck are usually the most common explanations when something doesn't advance. However, few stop to observe with honesty the factor that most influences everything they do and stop doing: the way they think each day. Your way of thinking is not neutral. It's constantly influencing your decisions, your actions, and your limits, even when you're not conscious of it. Each time you choose to try or avoid something, each time you decide to continue or abandon, there's a previous thought that guides that behavior. That's why, when results don't arrive, it's not always because capacity is lacking, but because the mind is not functioning in a way that sustains advance. A person can have clear goals and still not achieve them. They can know what they want, but not advance toward it constantly. This occurs when there exists a disconnection between what is desired and the habitual way of thinking. Wanting is not enough if the mind is trained to doubt, postpone, or avoid sustained effort. In that case, intention exists, but mental structure doesn't accompany. Thinking determines how you interpret reality. Before a difficulty, a mind trained to advance seeks solutions. A disordered mind stops at the problem. Before an error, a firm mind learns. A mind without clarity punishes itself and loses impulse. It's not the fact itself that defines a result, but the way you process it internally. Many people live with an internal dialogue that limits their growth. Phrases repeated over and over, like it's not the moment, I'm not enough, or this is too much for me. They install themselves and become unquestionable truths. Over time, these ideas not only influence how one thinks, but also what one attempts and what one discards before starting. Thus, the mind becomes the first obstacle to achieving goals and dreams. The way of thinking also defines a relationship with effort. When the mind is poorly oriented, any difficulty is perceived as a signal to stop. Tiredness is interpreted as incapacity and slow progress as failure. Instead, when thought is aligned with objectives, effort is understood as part of the process and not as a threat. The difference is not in the difficulty, but in how it's interpreted. A key point many people overlook is that the mind learns by repetition. It doesn't distinguish between useful thoughts and harmful thoughts. It simply reinforces that which repeats most frequently. If you repeat doubts, your mind strengthens in doubt. If you repeat clarity, it strengthens in clarity. That's why the habitual way of thinking ends up becoming a silent identity that guides your actions without asking permission. When you don't review how you think, you live on automatic. You make decisions based on old mental habits. Many of them learned without questioning. Beliefs you didn't consciously choose continue influencing your current life. This explains why some people repeat the same results for years, even when they desire something different. They haven't changed their way of thinking. They've only changed their desires. Thinking better doesn't mean eliminating doubts completely. It means learning not to let doubts direct your decisions. It means recognizing limiting thoughts without obeying them immediately. A trained mind doesn't react to everything that appears in it. It observes, evaluates, and decides with intention. That control is what marks the difference between advancing constantly or being trapped in indecision. To begin aligning your way of thinking with what you want to achieve, it's fundamental to make a conscious pause. Ask yourself with honesty what ideas repeat when you face an important challenge. What thoughts appear when you decide to start something new? What internal dialogue arises when things don't go as you expected? These answers clearly reveal if your mind is working in favor of your goals or against them. A simple but powerful practice is this. Each time you propose a goal, observe what thought appears immediately. Not the one you say out loud, but the first one, the automatic one. That thought is usually the most faithful reflection of your current mental programming. Identify it doesn't eliminate it, but return something fundamental to you, the capacity to choose whether to follow it or not. The way you think today is defining what you achieve tomorrow, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Because if you recognize your thought influences your results, you also recognize you can train it, not to change everything from one day to the next, but to start thinking in a way that backs your goals instead of sabotaging them. This is a first real step. If you want to achieve more, it's not enough to desire it. You need to review and strengthen the way you think when you act, when you doubt, and when you get tired. Because when your mind begins to work with direction, progress stops depending on chance and begins to build itself consciously. Chapter 2. The way you think determines how you act. The way a person acts is not random. Each action, each decision, and each reaction is born from a previous thought, even when that thought goes unnoticed. That's why, when someone asks themselves why they don't advance as they expect, the answer is rarely in lack of effort. More frequently, it's in the way they think just before acting or stopping. The mind constantly interprets reality, evaluates risks, measures possibilities, and anticipates consequences. The problem appears when that interpretation is not clear or conscious. In that case, action becomes inconsistent. Sometimes you advance with decision, and other times you stop without knowing exactly why. It's not lack of will, it's lack of mental coherence. A mind that doesn't have clarity acts from reaction. It responds to what occurs in the moment, to what pressures, to what makes uncomfortable. In that state, decisions are not made based on goals, but on immediate emotions. Tiredness, doubt, or fear come to direct behavior. Thus, even people with good intentions end up distancing themselves from what they really want to achieve. When the way of thinking is not aligned with objectives, action loses force. You start tasks you don't finish. You change direction easily. You commit to something and then retreat. Not because you're inconstant, but because your thought doesn't sustain a clear line of action. The mind disperses and the body follows it. Thinking with clarity doesn't mean having all the answers. It means having criteria, knowing what deserves your energy and what doesn't, knowing when to advance and when to adjust. A mind with defined criteria acts more firmly, even in the middle of uncertainty. Instead, a mind without clear criteria doubts before each obstacle and transforms any difficulty into an excuse to stop. The relationship between thought and action also manifests in discipline. Discipline is not permanent willpower. It's coherence between what you think and what you do. When your thought is aligned with your goals, acting becomes more natural. When it's not, each action feels like an internal struggle. Many people believe they need more motivation to act. In reality, they need more clarity. Motivation appears and disappears. Clarity remains. A clear mind doesn't need to be motivated all the time to advance. It knows why it does what it does, and that's enough to sustain action, even on difficult days. Another important aspect is the relationship with error. The way you think determines how you react when something doesn't go as expected. A disordered mind interprets error as personal failure. A clear mind interprets it as information. In the first case, action breaks. In the second, it adjusts and continues. The difference is not in the error, but in the thought that accompanies it. Acting consistently requires a mind that doesn't sabotage itself in silence. Many people tell themselves they want to advance, but think in a way that reinforces doubt. That internal contradiction wears down. Thinking one thing and doing another generates constant tension. Over time, that tension reduces the capacity to sustain effort. To strengthen the relationship between thought and action, it's necessary to observe what occurs in your mind before acting. What ideas appear when you decide to start something? What thoughts arise when difficulty appears? That observation doesn't seek to judge. It seeks to understand, because only when you understand how you think can you begin to adjust how you act. A useful practice is to simplify. When the mind saturates, action blocks. Too many options generate paralysis. Thinking with clarity implies reducing the unnecessary and focusing on the essential. When you know what's important, acting becomes more direct and less heavy. Sustained action is not born from external pressure, but from internal coherence. When what you think backs what you do, advancing stops feeling forced, not because it's easy, but because it makes sense. That sense is what allows continuing even when progress is slow. The way you think today is directly influencing how you act each day. And the way you act each day is building your results, even when you don't see them immediately. Adjusting your thought is not a superficial change. It's a deep correction that reflects little by little in firmer actions, clearer decisions, and a different relationship with effort. When thought and action begin to align, advance stops being irregular. Obstacles don't disappear, but confusion diminishes. Tiredness is not eliminated, but doubt reduces. And in that state, sustaining your goals stops depending on the impulse of the moment and starts relying on a more stable and conscious way of thinking. Chapter 3. The internal dialogue that strengthens or weakens your advance. Most people are not conscious of the constant conversation they maintain with themselves. That internal dialogue doesn't always express itself in clear words, but is present in the form of repeated thoughts, silent judgments, and quick conclusions about what's possible or not. Although not always noticed, that internal voice directly influences the way a person faces their goals and sustains their effort. Each time you make a decision, there's a previous thought that backs it or breaks it. That thought is born from the way you speak to yourself internally. If your internal dialogue reinforces doubt, action loses force. If it reinforces clarity, action sustains itself. It's not about thinking positively in a forced way, but about observing with honesty what type of messages you're repeating without questioning them. Many people try to advance while maintaining an internal dialogue that wears them down. They demand results from themselves, but criticize themselves for each error. They propose goals, but anticipate failure before starting. This internal contradiction constantly consumes energy, not because the goal is too big, but because the mind works against one's own effort. Internal dialogue forms over time. It's built from experiences, interpretations, and repetitions, heard phrases. Constant comparisons and hasty conclusions transform into a habitual way of thinking about oneself. Over time, that way of thinking becomes automatic and begins to define what one attempts and what one avoids. A mind that speaks to itself from distrust finds reasons to stop. A mind that speaks to itself from clarity seeks ways to continue. It's not a difference of personality. It's a difference of mental training. Internal dialogue doesn't appear by chance. It reinforces each time it's not questioned. When internal dialogue is negative or disordered, even advances lose value. Small achievements are minimized and minor errors are amplified. This generates a distorted perception of progress. The person feels it's never enough, that something more is always lacking. In that state, sustaining a goal becomes increasingly heavy. Strengthening internal dialogue doesn't mean ignoring difficulties. It means learning to speak to yourself in a way that doesn't weaken action, recognizing an error without converting it into a condemnation, accepting tiredness without interpreting it as incapacity, adjusting course without abandoning the path. An essential practice is to listen to how you speak to yourself when things don't go as expected, not when everything goes well, but when frustration appears. That's where internal dialogue shows its true impact. If in those moments your mind becomes hard, critical, and disordered, advance breaks. If it becomes firm and clear, advance continues, even if at a different rhythm. Internal dialogue also influences constancy. A mind that speaks to itself with coherence sustains effort even without immediate results. It doesn't need to punish itself to advance. It knows progress is gradual and that each action counts. Instead, a mind that speaks to itself from pressure needs quick results to continue. When it doesn't obtain them, it stops. Changing internal dialogue is not an immediate process. It requires attention and practice. It implies detecting automatic thoughts and deciding if they really contribute something. Not every thought deserves to be followed. Some only repeat old patterns that no longer serve your current goals. When you begin to adjust the way you speak to yourself, something changes in your relationship with effort. Action stops feeling like a constant struggle and starts being perceived as a sustained process. Difficulties don't disappear, but internal wear diminishes. And that difference, although subtle, has a profound impact in the long term. The way you speak to yourself each day is influencing what you build, not as a minor detail, but as a central factor. Strengthening your internal dialogue doesn't make you invincible, but makes you more stable. And that stability is what allows advancing with fewer interruptions and more clarity. When internal dialogue stops sabotaging and starts accompanying, the path toward your goals becomes more coherent, not because everything is easy, but because your mind stops being an additional burden. At that point, sustaining advance stops depending on pressure and starts relying on a more conscious way of thinking about yourself while you act. Chapter 4. Mental clarity sustains constancy. Constancy doesn't depend solely on willpower. It depends largely on the level of clarity with which a person thinks and decides. When the mind is clear, advancing becomes simpler, not because difficulties disappear, but because the internal friction that usually wears down sustained effort reduces. Many people begin with enthusiasm, but lose constancy over time. They interpret that abandonment as lack of discipline or commitment, when in reality the problem is usually in mental confusion. Poorly defined goals, changing priorities, and unreal expectations create a difficult internal environment to sustain. In that context, the mind tires before the body. Mental clarity allows sustaining course, even when motivation fluctuates. You don't need to feel inspired all the time to advance. You need to know with precision what you're doing and why you're doing it. When that purpose is clear, action maintains itself even on days when mood is low or progress seems slow. A confused mind demands immediate results. A clear mind understands processes. This difference is fundamental. When there's no clarity, each obstacle is lived as a signal of failure. When there's clarity, obstacles are interpreted as part of the path. They're not dramatized or ignored. They're faced with criteria. Constancy breaks when the mind saturates. Too many goals at the same time, too many internal demands, and too many external comparisons fragment focus. Thinking with clarity implies reducing, choosing, stopping carrying more than necessary. When the mind lightens, constancy becomes more natural. Another key factor is the relationship with time. A mind without clarity lives hurried or stuck. It always feels it's late or doesn't advance enough. That perception generates constant pressure and wear. Instead, a clear mind understands its own rhythm. It advances with regularity, without demanding disproportionate results in unreal deadlines. Clarity also protects mental energy. When you know what's important, you stop dispersing yourself in the secondary. You don't react to everything. You don't try to fulfill everything. This doesn't mean neglecting responsibilities, but ordering them. A clear mind decides where it puts attention and where not. That decision is the base of constancy. Many people abandon not because they can't continue, but because they don't see sense in continuing. Sense is lost when the mind doesn't remember purpose. Clarity keeps that purpose alive, not as an intense emotion, but as a constant reference. You know where you're going, even when the path becomes uncomfortable. Maintaining mental clarity requires simple but consistent habits. Reviewing your goals with honesty, adjusting expectations when necessary, recognizing advances without exaggerating or minimizing them. These actions sustain focus and avoid the mind disordering easily. When clarity strengthens, constancy stops feeling forced. You don't need to push yourself all the time. Action flows with greater coherence, not because it's easy, but because it has direction. That direction reduces doubt, postponement, and emotional where that usually interrupt progress. True constancy is not rigid. It's flexible and conscious. It adapts without losing course. A clear mind understands when to adjust without abandoning and when to insist without wearing down. That capacity doesn't appear from nowhere. It's built from a more ordered and less reactive way of thinking. As mental clarity consolidates, the relationship with effort changes. You stop seeing constancy as a burden and start seeing it as a natural way of advancing. You don't ask yourself every day if it's worth continuing. You simply continue because your mind understands the value of the process. Clarity doesn't guarantee immediate results, but it does guarantee something essential: continuity. And when continuity maintains itself, results stop depending on momentary impulses and begin to build themselves in a sustained way. That's the difference between trying from time to time and advancing constantly toward what you propose. Chapter 5. Thinking with intention changes the way you advance. Most people think automatically. Their thoughts appear as response to what occurs around, to what others say, to what they feel in the moment. In that state, the mind doesn't direct the path. It only reacts to it. Thinking with intention is the opposite. It's consciously deciding how to think before acting, before responding, and before giving up. When there's no intention in thought, decisions are made from inertia. What has always been done is done. The same patterns repeat, and different results are expected. This contradiction usually goes unnoticed, but has a profound impact on personal advance. Without intention, even constant effort can direct itself toward places that don't lead to what one really wants to achieve. Thinking with intention implies stopping, not to doubt, but to choose. Choosing what thoughts to feed and which not to follow. Choosing from where to interpret a difficulty. Choosing if an experience becomes learning or excuse. This capacity of choice doesn't appear alone. It's built when the mind stops functioning on automatic. A mind without intention disperses easily, changes focus before any stimulus, lets itself be carried by others' urgencies, and loses sight of its own priorities. In that state, the day fills with activity, but real advance dilutes. Thinking with intention returns direction. It doesn't eliminate external demands, but allows responding to them without losing course. Intention in thought also redefines a relationship with goals. Instead of thinking about them only when there's enthusiasm, they integrate constantly in daily decisions. Each action, however small, is evaluated based on whether it brings closer or distances from the objective. This way of thinking is not rigid. It's conscious. It adjusts without abandoning and advances without dispersing. Many people believe thinking with intention is controlling each thought. It's not. It's recognizing not every thought deserves attention. Some ideas appear by habit, by fear, or by tiredness. Following them without questioning weakens action. Thinking with intention is observing them and deciding if they contribute something to the path you're building. Intention also strengthens making difficult decisions. When you know with clarity what you want to achieve, saying no becomes simpler, not because it's comfortable, but because it makes sense. A mind with intention doesn't need to constantly justify itself. Its decisions rely on a clear direction, not on external approval. Thinking with intention changes the way the process is lived. Advance stops depending on mood of the moment. There are days of greater energy and days of tiredness, but direction maintains itself. This reduces a constant oscillation between impulse and abandonment that so many people experience when their thought is not aligned with their goals. Another important aspect is a relationship with time. A mind without intention lives trapped between haste and postponement. A mind with intention uses time as resource. It knows when to advance, when to adjust, and when to stop without guilt. This management is not perfect, but it's conscious, and that consciousness marks the difference in the long term. Thinking with intention also reduces mental wear. When each thought has a purpose, internal noise diminishes. The mind becomes simpler, not because it thinks less, but because it thinks better. This clarity frees energy that before was lost in repetitive doubts and unnecessary decisions. Intention in thought is not imposed from one day to the next. It reinforces with constant practice. Each time you choose to respond with clarity, instead of reacting, you strengthen that capacity. Each time you decide to think before acting, you consolidate a more coherent way of advancing. As thinking with intention becomes habitual, progress acquires stability. Obstacles and difficulties don't disappear, but stop deviating the path. The mind learns to sustain a direction even when the environment is changing. Thinking with intention doesn't guarantee immediate results, but it does build something more valuable, coherence. And when there's coherence between what you think, what you decide, and what you do, advance stops being a coincidence. It becomes a natural consequence of a mind that has learned to direct itself while advancing. Chapter 6. The trained mind sustains advance in difficult moments. The true challenge doesn't appear when everything advances with ease. It appears when tiredness accumulates, when results delay, and when doubt begins to install itself. In those moments, it's not motivation that sustains the path, but the way the mind has been trained to respond before difficulty. A mind without training interprets difficult moments as signals to stop. Any obstacle is perceived as confirmation something is not working. Instead, a trained mind understands difficulty is not an exception, but part of the process. This difference is not minor. It defines if a person continues or abandons when progress stops being comfortable. Mental training doesn't consist of eliminating discomfort. It consists of learning to coexist with it without losing direction. Thinking advancing will always be comfortable creates unreal expectations. When those expectations aren't fulfilled, frustration appears. A trained mind doesn't expect constant comfort. It expects coherence. It knows there will be moments of wear and doesn't interpret them as personal failure. In difficult moments, thought becomes more influential than ever. The mind begins to emit quick judgments, anticipated conclusions, and exaggerated warnings. If these thoughts are accepted without questioning, action weakens. Not because the goal is incorrect, but because internal dialogue is not prepared to sustain pressure. A trained mind learns to differentiate between a real signal of adjustment and a passing emotional reaction. Not all tiredness indicates you must stop. Not all doubt means you're wrong. This capacity of discernment is built with conscious practice. It doesn't appear by chance or by momentary willpower. Mental training also redefines a relationship with error. Instead of converting it into an emotional burden, it's observed as part of learning. Error stops being a reason to punish oneself and becomes useful information. This way of thinking doesn't eliminate discomfort, but avoids discomfort transforming into abandonment. Many people abandon not because they can't continue, but because they're not mentally prepared to sustain the process when it loses attractiveness. Initial enthusiasm fades and the mind, without training, seeks immediate relief. At that point, emotional rest is prioritized over commitment to the goal. A trained mind recognizes that impulse and doesn't obey it automatically. Sustained advance requires a mind that knows how to remain when emotion fluctuates. It's not about ignoring what one feels, but not allowing what one feels to decide completely. The trained mind observes discomfort, accepts it, and continues acting with criteria. That capacity marks a profound difference in the long term. Another key aspect of mental training is patience. An untrained mind demands quick results. A trained mind understands the rhythm of progress. It doesn't accelerate impulsively or stop from impatience. It maintains a constant speed, even when results are not immediately visible. Mental training also strengthens internal confidence, not confidence based on external results, but on the capacity to sustain effort. You know you can continue not because everything goes well, but because you've learned to handle moments when it doesn't go well. That confidence is silent but firm. Training the mind doesn't imply rigidity. It implies conscious flexibility. adjusting when necessary without abandoning course, changing strategies without renouncing the goal. This flexibility avoids extreme wear and allows advancing with greater stability. As the mind trains, perception of difficulty changes. What before seemed unbearable becomes manageable, not because it's easy, but because it no longer surprises. The mind knows what to expect and how to respond. That preparation reduces the emotional impact of difficult moments. Sustaining advance when conditions are not ideal is a skill built over time. Each time you choose to continue with clarity, instead of reacting from tiredness, you reinforce that training. Each time you don't abandon before first discomfort, you strengthen your capacity to advance with coherence. When the mind learns to sustain itself in difficult moments, progress stops depending on favorable circumstances. Effort is not eliminated, but fragility is eliminated. And at that point, advancing stops being a constant struggle and becomes a natural consequence of a mind that has learned to stay firm while acting. Chapter 7. Internal coherence defines the stability of your results. Stability in results doesn't appear by chance, nor does it depend solely on talent or the intensity with which one acts in certain moments. In most cases, stability is a direct consequence of internal coherence, of alignment between what a person thinks, what they decide, and what they do constantly. When there's no internal coherence, advance becomes irregular. There are moments of impulses followed by retreats, days of clarity that alternate with periods of confusion, not because capacity is lacking, but because the mind doesn't sustain a clear line of behavior. Thinking one thing, deciding another, and acting in a third way generates wear and loss of stability. Internal coherence begins in thought. When what you think is aligned with your goals, decisions become simpler. You don't need to analyze each situation from scratch. There are clear criteria that guide your conduct. Instead, when thought is contradictory, each decision becomes an internal struggle that consumes energy and weakens constancy. Many people believe their results are unstable because the environment changes or because circumstances don't always accompany. However, what usually changes more frequently is the way they think facing those circumstances. One day they trust themselves, and the next they doubt. One day they commit, and the next they relativize that commitment. That internal oscillation inevitably reflects in results. Coherence doesn't imply absolute rigidity. It implies consistency. It means acting according to what you say is important to you, even when it's not comfortable doing it. A coherent mind doesn't need to constantly justify itself. Its decisions have a clear base, and that reduces the need to rethink everything before each difficulty. When there's no internal coherence, self-justification appears. Reasons are sought not to advance, to postpone, or to change course without real cause. These justifications momentarily relieve discomfort, but weaken long-term stability. The mind gets used in negotiating with itself, and advance loses firmness. Coherence also influences a relationship with effort. A coherent mind understands effort doesn't always feel the same, but doesn't interpret as a signal to stop. It knows there will be days of greater clarity and days of greater tiredness. Still, it maintains conduct aligned with its objectives. That continuity is what builds stable results. Another fundamental aspect is coherence between expectations and actions. Many people expect results that don't correspond to the level of commitment they sustain. This disconnection generates frustration. A coherent mind adjusts expectations or adjusts actions, but doesn't maintain both in permanent contradiction. That constant adjustment avoids unnecessary emotional wear. Stability is also affected by emotional coherence. Reacting extremely before each difficulty disorganizes action. A coherent mind doesn't ignore emotions, but doesn't allow them to completely define conduct. It observes what it feels and acts with criteria. This emotional regulation sustains advance even in demanding contexts. Building internal coherence requires continuous attention. IT implies reviewing with honesty if what you do is aligned with what you say you want to achieve, not as an exercise of self-demand, but as a form of conscious correction. The more frequent that review is, the more stable behavior becomes. As coherence strengthens, results begin to stabilize, not because challenges disappear, but because response before them becomes more predictable and firm. The mind stops oscillating between extremes and learns to sustain a clear direction. Internal coherence doesn't guarantee immediate success, but does build a solid base. It allows advancing without depending on mood of the moment or external validation. That base is what differentiates those who progress in a sustained way from those who advance intermittently. When thought, decision, and action begin to align constantly, stability stops being a distant goal. It becomes a natural consequence of a mind that has learned to stay faithful to its direction, even when the path demands adjustments. And in that state, progress stops being fragile and begins to consolidate with greater firmness. Chapter 8. Mental Responsibility redefines your relationship with results. Assuming mental responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything that occurs. It means recognizing with honesty the role your way of thinking has in the results you build. While a person attributes everything to environment, to circumstances, or to others, their capacity to influence their own advance reduces. When you recognize your mental responsibility, you recover control. Mental responsibility begins when you stop automatically reacting to what happens. Instead of asking yourself why something occurred, you start asking yourself how you're interpreting it and what decision arises from that interpretation. That shift in focus is subtle but profound. It moves the center of action from exterior toward the mind. Many people confuse responsibility with pressure. They believe assuming mental responsibility implies demanding more from themselves than they can sustain. In reality, the opposite occurs. Mental responsibility reduces unnecessary pressure because it eliminates the sensation of being at the mercy of what happens. You don't control everything, but you do control how you think facing what occurs. When there's no mental responsibility, decisions dilute. Lack of advance is justified with external explanations, and the same patterns repeat without questioning them. This way of thinking can momentarily relieve discomfort, but maintain stagnation. The mind gets used to explaining instead of adjusting. Assuming mental responsibility implies observing your thoughts with more rigor, not to punish yourself, but to understand them. Identify when an idea propels you and when it limits you, recognizing what interpretations strengthen you and which weaken you. This constant observation is not heavy when it becomes habit. It integrates naturally in the way of deciding. Mental responsibility also redefines a relationship with results that don't arrive. Instead of interpreting absence of results as failure, it's observed as information. Something in the way of thinking, deciding, or acting needs adjustment. This perspective avoids dramatism and favors conscious correction. The objective is not abandoned. Focus is adjusted. Another key aspect is the relationship with internal complaint. When the mind gets used to complaining, it loses clarity. Complaint displaces attention from adjustment toward emotional discharge. Assuming mental responsibility doesn't mean denying what makes uncomfortable, but not staying trapped in it. Recognizing discomfort and continuing thinking with direction. Mental responsibility strengthens autonomy. You stop depending so much on external stimuli to advance. You don't need constant approval or ideal conditions. You know your way of thinking directly influences how you move, and that consciousness allows you to act with greater independence. This responsibility also reflects inconstancy. When you understand your mind actively participates in each advance and each retreat, you care more for what you allow to occupy your attention. You don't feed thoughts you know weaken you, not because you ignore them, but because you choose not to follow them. Assuming mental responsibility doesn't make you rigid. It makes you more conscious. You can recognize errors without losing stability. You can accept temporal limits without renouncing your goals. The mind stops seeking excuses and starts seeking adjustments. That transition is one of the most important in the path towards sustained results. Mental responsibility also modifies the relationship with time. You stop waiting for the perfect moment and start acting with what you have, not from urgency, but from clarity. You understand each mental decision you make today is influencing tomorrow, even when impact is not immediate. As mental responsibility strengthens, sensation control increases, not because everything is predictable, but because you know how to respond. That internal security doesn't depend on things going well, but on your capacity to think with criteria when they don't go as expected. Mental responsibility doesn't promise guaranteed results, but it does build a solid base to advance with coherence. It reduces dependence on chance and increases capacity of adjustment. And when a person assumes that responsibility, their relationship with results changes. They stop being something that simply occurs and become a direct consequence of a mind that actively participates in its own path. Chapter 9. Mental constancy sustains progress long term. Real progress doesn't depend on isolated moments of intense effort. It depends on mental constancy, with which a person sustains their decisions over time. Many people advance with force during a period, but then stop, not because they can't continue, but because their mind is not prepared to maintain a direction when novelty disappears. Mental constancy is not based on feeling motivated every day. It's based on thinking in a way that backs continuity, even when enthusiasm lowers. A mind that needs to feel good to advance is fragile. A mind that understands the value of process can sustain effort even when mood fluctuates. When mental constancy is not present, goals become intermittent. They're retaken over and over, but never consolidate. This generates where, because each restart consumes emotional energy, the mind gets used to starting, but not to sustaining. Over time, this dynamic weakens internal confidence. Mental constancy is built from small but firm decisions. It's not about demanding more, but about thinking with coherence day after day, choosing to continue even when progress is slow, choosing to maintain habits even when there are no visible results. These choices strengthen the mind more than any momentary impulse. An inconstant mind interprets pauses as failures. A constant mind interprets them as part of rhythm. Not all advance is linear. There will be moments of adjustment, of lesser intensity, and of review. The difference is in not abandoning direction. Mental constancy allows traversing these moments without breaking process. Another important factor is the relationship with repetition. Many people tire of repeating necessary actions because their mind seeks constant novelty. However, results are built through well-directed repetitions. Mental constancy allows valuing repetition as consolidation and not as stagnation. Constancy is also affected by the way a person speaks to themselves when advance is slow. If internal dialogue becomes critical, the mind seeks to escape. If it maintains itself clear and firm, process continues. The way of thinking during these periods defines if progress interrupts or sustains. Maintaining mental constancy implies accepting not all days feel the same. Some days require more conscious effort. Others flow with greater ease. A constant mind doesn't confuse itself before these variations. It maintains its direction without dramatizing rhythm changes. Mental constancy also reduces dependence on external stimuli. You don't need constant reminders or external pressure to continue. You know why you do what you do, and that's enough to sustain action. This mental autonomy strengthens long-term progress. When a mind gets used to sustaining decisions, action becomes more stable. There are no abrupt changes of direction before each difficulty. Goals stop feeling fragile and begin to consolidate over time. This stability is not product of rigidity, but of a more mature and conscious way of thinking. Mental constancy doesn't eliminate tiredness or doubts. What it eliminates is impulsive reaction before them. Instead of stopping automatically, you learn to adjust without abandoning. This capacity is one of the most important for any process that requires time and commitment. As mental constancy strengthens, perception of progress changes. You stop evaluating each day as success or failure. You start observing advance in broader periods. This perspective reduces anxiety and allows sustaining effort with greater balance. Mental constancy doesn't promise quick results, but it does promise solid results. It builds a different relationship with time, effort, and waiting. And when a person develops this way of thinking, progress stops depending on sporadic impulses and begins to rely on a mind that knows how to stay firm while advancing. Chapter 10. Mental identity determines how far you get. Beyond what you do punctually, there exists something deeper that influences your results. Mental identity. The way you perceive yourself conditions what you attempt, what you sustain, and what you abandon. You don't act only based on what you desire, but based on what you believe you're capable of sustaining. Mental identity is not defined by what you say you want to be, but by what you do consistently. It's built from repeated thoughts, habitual decisions, and sustained behaviors over time. With the passing of days, that repetition becomes an internal reference that guides your actions almost without you noticing. When mental identity is weak or confused, advance becomes unstable. You can propose important goals, but before first difficulty, the sensation of not being up to it appears, not because you're not, but because your internal identity hasn't yet aligned with what you try to build. At that point, the mind seeks to return to known, even though that implies stagnating. Many people try to change results without reviewing their mental identity. They want new habits, new goals, and new achievements, but continue thinking about themselves the same way. This contradiction generates internal resistance. Behavior tries to advance, but identity pulls backward. The result is frustration and abandonment. Mental identity reinforces with coherence. Each time you act according to what you say is important to you, that identity strengthens. Each time you contradict yourself constantly, it weakens. It's not an immediate process, but it is cumulative. Small repeated actions have a profound impact on how you perceive yourself. A solid mental identity doesn't eliminate doubt, but reduces its power. Doubt appears, but doesn't define conduct. You know who you are and where you're heading. Even when the path becomes demanding, that internal clarity allows sustaining decisions without need for constant validation. Mental identity also influences the type of goals you allow yourself to pursue. A mind that perceives itself limited chooses safe objectives. A mind that perceives itself capable chooses challenges. This choice is not always conscious, but marks a significant difference in the reach of results. Modifying mental identity doesn't imply adopting a false image of yourself. It implies aligning your internal perception with the person you're building through your actions. It's not about imagining yourself different, but acting consistently until that way of acting becomes part of you. The relationship between identity and constancy is direct. When an action is coherent with your identity, sustaining it requires less effort, not because it's easy, but because it makes sense. Instead, when you act against how you perceive yourself, each step feels forced and temporary. Mental identity also defines how you interpret retreats. A fragile mind sees them as confirmation of incapacity. A solid mind interprets them as part of the process. It doesn't question itself before each difficulty. It adjusts, learns, and continues. As mental identity strengthens, advance becomes more stable. Decisions stop depending so much on emotional state of the moment. There's a clear internal reference that sustains behavior. That reference doesn't appear from nowhere. It's built with sustained coherence. Mental identity doesn't change with occasional affirmations. It transforms when a way of thinking, deciding, and acting begins to align constantly. Over time, that alignment redefines what you consider possible for you. When a person strengthens their mental identity, progress stops feeling borrowed or temporary. It becomes their own, not because everything goes well, but because the mind stops doubting its capacity to sustain the path. And at that point, advancing stops being an exception and becomes a natural expression of who you are while building your results. Chapter 11. The focused mind reduces dispersion and strengthens advance. One of the main obstacles to achieving goals is not lack of capacity, but mental dispersion. When the mind divides itself in too many directions at the same time, advance loses force. Many things are done, but few sustain themselves. Effort exists, but doesn't consolidate. In that state, tiredness appears without clear results. Mental dispersion is not always evident. It can manifest as excess of ideas, multiple simultaneous objectives, or fragmented attention. The mind jumps from one task to another without finishing any with clarity. This dynamic generates a sensation of being busy all the time, but without firm direction. Progress dilutes among incomplete attempts. A focused mind doesn't do more things. It does fewer, but better. Focus is not rigidity. It's conscious election. Choosing where to put attention also implies choosing what to leave out. This decision is not comfortable at first, but is necessary for advance to have continuity and depth. When focus is lacking, goals become fragile. Any external stimulus can deviate them. Others' opinions, comparisons, or momentary urgencies take prominence and displace the important. In that scenario, the mind loses its center and behavior follows it, not because commitment is lacking, but because there's no clear axis. Mental focus strengthens decision-making. When you know what's priority, deciding becomes simpler. You don't need to evaluate all options each time. There are clear criteria that filter the unnecessary. This clarity reduces mental fatigue and allows sustaining effort without exhausting prematurely. Many people confuse focus with extreme pressure. They believe focusing implies demanding constantly from oneself. In reality, the opposite occurs. Focus reduces pressure because it eliminates the need to respond to everything. The mind stops feeling pulled in multiple directions and can advance with greater calm and coherence. Focus also redefines a relationship with time. A dispersed mind feels it never reaches. A focused mind uses time with greater intention, not because it has more hours, but because it decides better how to use them. This conscious management of time strengthens the sensation of real advance. Another important aspect of mental focus is the capacity to remain. Remaining in a task even when it loses attractiveness. Remaining in a process when results are not immediate. This permanence is not obstinacy. It's commitment to a chosen direction. The focused mind understands constantly changing weakens progress. Focus is trained reducing noise. Fewer unnecessary stimuli, fewer comparisons, and fewer mental distractions. It's not about isolating from the world, but about protecting attention. Attention is a limited resource. Where it's directed, advance is built or energy is lost. When mental focus strengthens, the mind stops fragmenting easily to a sensation of internal order appears. You know what you're doing and why you're doing it. This clarity reduces anxiety and increases emotional stability during process. Focus also impacts quality of effort. It's not just about doing, but doing with presence. A focused mind involves itself more deeply in what it does. That depth reflects in better results and in greater sensation of internal coherence. As focus consolidates, dispersion loses power. Distractions don't disappear, but stop dominating. The mind learns to return to its axis over and over without frustrating. That capacity of return is one of the most valuable skills to sustain long-term goals. The focused mind doesn't promise speed, but it does promise solidity. It allows advancing without diluting effort in multiple directions, and when advance is built from clear focus, results stop being accidental and begin to reflect a more ordered, more conscious, and more aligned way of thinking with what you really want to achieve. Chapter 12. When the mind orders itself, the path becomes possible. Throughout this audiobook, an idea has sustained itself constantly. The way you think directly influences the way you decide, act, and build results, not as an abstract theory, but as a practical relationship that manifests each day, even when you don't observe it consciously. When the mind is disordered, the path becomes confusing, goals lose force, decisions dilate, and effort disperses, not because desire to advance is lacking, but because the mind is not prepared to sustain direction. In that state, even opportunities are wasted and progress becomes irregular. As the mind organizes, something changes in a gradual and profound way. Decisions become clearer. Action simplifies. Effort stops feeling chaotic. Challenges and difficulties don't disappear, but the way of facing them is different. The mind no longer reacts automatically. It begins to respond with criteria. Order in the mind doesn't mean eliminating uncertainty. It means learning to advance despite it. It means understanding you don't need to have everything resolved to act, but you do need to think with sufficient clarity not to sabotage yourself in the process. That clarity is not perfect, but it's functional, and that's enough to advance. Achieving what you propose doesn't depend on thinking big constantly. It depends on thinking with coherence, on sustaining a way of thinking that accompanies your goals even when progress is slow. When the mind becomes an ally, advance stops being an internal struggle and starts being a more stable process. Throughout this journey, you've seen how thought influences action, how internal dialogue strengthens or weakens effort, how clarity sustains constancy, and how mental identity defines how far you allow yourself to reach. Nothing of this functions in isolation. Everything integrates in a way of thinking that, over time, defines a way of living. It's not about changing everything all at once. It's about starting to think in a way that doesn't contradict what you want to build, about observing your thoughts with more attention, about choosing with more intention, about acting with greater coherence. These adjustments are not always noticed immediately, but they accumulate, and that accumulation is the base of real progress. When the mind stops being an obstacle, the path becomes possible, not easy, not immediate, but possible. Possible to sustain, possible to travel with less wear, possible to continue even when doubts or tiredness appear. That possibility doesn't come from exterior. It's born from a mind that has learned to order itself. This audiobook doesn't pretend to give you closed answers. It pretends to offer you a different way of observing how you think and how that influences what you achieve. True transformation doesn't occur upon finishing listening. It occurs when you begin to apply what you've understood in your daily decisions, even in the smallest ones. If you arrived here, it's not casualty. There's an underlying intention, perhaps a goal you want to sustain, a change you desire to consolidate, or a stage you want to overcome. The important thing is not to define it now, but to remember the way you think will continue influencing that process, whether you want it or not. And that's why the true closing is not in these words, but in what you do with them, in how you think tomorrow, in how you decide when nobody observes you, in how you act when enthusiasm lowers. That's where this content makes sense. The mind doesn't guarantee results by itself, but it does determine the quality of the path. When you think with clarity, with coherence, and with intention, advancing stops depending on chance. It becomes a consequence of more ordered, more conscious, and more aligned way of thinking with what you propose to achieve. Everything is in your mind, not as an empty promise, but as a silent responsibility. And when you learn to think better, the path toward what you want to achieve stops seeming impossible and starts feeling reachable step by step, decision after decision. If this audiobook has given you a new perspective on how your mind shapes your reality, I invite you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Here we continue exploring how to build a mentality oriented toward real progress, sustainable results, and genuine transformation. Hit that subscribe button, activate notifications, and become part of a community that understands success begins in the mind. And don't forget to leave in the comments one goal that's important to you right now. Naming it is the first step toward making it real. Thank you for listening, and remember, everything starts in your mind. See you in the next video.